Lyanna Stark was dying among the rushes of fresh straw and the remnants of her own blood. The tower walls were thick and gray, but the hot Dornish sun still found its way through the narrow windows, falling across her face in feverish slants of gold. Ned Stark knelt at his sister's side, his throat tight with fear. The smell of sweat, blood, and dust lay heavy on the air. Each breath she drew seemed to come from some deep, painful place, and he feared every one of them might be her last. He pressed a damp cloth to Lyanna's forehead. Ser Arthur Dayne, the sword of the morning, lay dead somewhere behind him. Ser Oswell went, and Lord Commander Gerald Hightower had also fallen. Howland Reed hovered near the door, unwilling to intrude on the siblings' last moments together, for that was how it seemed. A final meeting in a tower that would haunt their memories for as long as they lived. Lyanna's eyes were glassy with pain and tears. "Promise me, Ned," she whispered. "Promise me you'll—" She winced. Whatever words she wanted to speak trailed off, lost to a sob. Ned thought he knew what she meant to say. He thought of Rhaegar Targaryen, dead now upon the Trident, and he thought of everything that had led to this terrible war. He thought of Robert Baratheon's fury, the vengeance that had propelled the Storm Lord to seize a warhammer and lead a rebellion. He recalled the clash of steel, the cries of men meeting on the field of battle, the hopes of noble houses forging alliances in desperation, and all of it culminating in this moment. Lyanna's hair was a tangle of sweat-drenched brown curls, clinging to her neck as she fought for breath. "They took me," she rasped. I didn't—" A tear slipped down her cheek. "Robert, Rhaegar." She squeezed her eyes shut, trembling. "I didn't want this." Ned drew closer. He was certain he was witnessing her last hours, and his heart felt like it might break inside his chest. "I know," he whispered, the words rough in his throat. Her hand clenched around his wrist, so weak he had to bend down and place his ear to her lips just to catch the faint words. "Promise me you'll keep him safe," she said, voice trembling. "My son." Ned froze. He had expected as much. That babe, small and warm, lay wrapped in blankets near the edge of the bed. He'd glimpsed the dark tufts of hair, the gray eyes, and had felt something stir within him that he could not name. This child was Rhaegar Targaryen's son, but also Lyanna Stark's, and for that, Ned would do anything to protect him. "I promise," Ned said at last, his voice trembling with the gravity of that oath. "I'll keep him safe." Lyanna's breathing slowed. For a moment, Ned swore the life had left her. Then, slowly, her eyes opened once more. That once bright gaze, so full of life in the days they had laughed in Winterfell's courtyard, found his own. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "Rest," he urged. He thought she would die then, but she clung to some invisible thread of life. After a minute that felt like an hour, her eyes closed again. Ned heard a ragged sigh, and she fell silent. He gazed at her still form, thinking she was gone. He let his head hang, exhausted beyond measure. The war, the battles, the secrets, it was all too much. He could scarcely stand beneath the weight of it. Then a soft moan escaped Lyanna's throat. She was alive, weak yes, but still breathing. In the hush of that tower chamber, Ned felt something close to hope. Howland Reed took a tentative step forward. "Is she?" "She lives," Ned said. "Somehow she still lives." Though exhaustion weighed him down, Ned found renewed determination surging in his veins. Lyanna needed help. The babe needed milk, care, and quiet. Ned could not linger in this cursed tower, not with Robert's forces sweeping the land, not with secrets that might incite the new king's wrath. "Howland," Ned said softly, his voice so low it felt hidden in the hush of the chamber. "Help me." They worked swiftly, taking the babe, gathering Lyanna in their arms as gently as possible, mindful of her faint gasps and moans. They fled the Tower of Joy, leaving only the ghosts of the Kingsguard behind. Between them, Ned and Howland bore Lyanna to a small camp outside the tower, then set out as soon as they could manage. Their horses labored beneath the weight of 3 riders, though Lyanna was so slight by then, as though her pain had hollowed her out, that the mare scarcely seemed to notice. Each day of travel threatened Lyanna's life anew. She drifted in and out of fever, sometimes awake enough to sip broth, sometimes mumbling in delirious half-dreams about the day Rhaegar crowned her queen of love and beauty, or about playing in the snow at Winterfell. The babe, so small he hardly seemed real, wailed often, but Ned tended him as best he could, using goat's milk and a bit of honey to keep him fed. Howland Reed was a boon companion in that regard, calm even in the face of such mortal peril. Yet a hush lay over them all, for they traveled deeper into the uncertain future with a woman that, by all rights, should have been dead. Robert Baratheon's victory had been sealed upon the trident, and word was that King's Landing had fallen, that the Mad King was dead, and that the dragon-blooded reign of House Targaryen was over. But the child in Ned's arms was Targaryen enough, Lyanna's blood or no. And if Robert discovered the truth, that the boy was Rhaegar's son, Ned had no illusions about what would happen. So, as the group moved north, Ned worked out a plan in secret. If Lyanna died, the boy would be safe with Ned, concealed as his bastard. He would name him Jon, after Jon Arryn, the man who had been like a father to him in the Vale. That, Ned felt certain, was the right thing. But if Lyanna survived, well, that was a more complicated matter. He had given his word to keep the child safe. If Lyanna chose to keep the babe's Targaryen heritage hidden, so be it. If she wanted to declare him Rhaegar's son, Ned would do all he could to shield her from Robert's wrath. But would Robert truly harm the woman he had once loved beyond measure? A question with no easy answer. Robert's hatred of Targaryens ran deep, for they had destroyed his family and torn away Lyanna. But for Lyanna herself, that love might burn just as strongly. Perhaps it would overshadow his rage. Or perhaps not. By slow degrees, the small party made its way to the outskirts of Harrenhal, that blackened fortress which still rose from the horizon like a twisted claw. Smoke from burnt camps drifted on the wind. Evidence of the war was everywhere. Rotted siege engines, flies buzzing around piles of discarded horse carcasses, half-burnt tents. Ned suppressed a shudder and guided the horses around the worst of it. Lyanna stirred in his arms, let out a whimper, but stayed quiet when he softly stroked her damp hair. Riverrun lay ahead, and Ned thought to seek help from the Tullus. His brother Brandon was dead, his father too, and so was Prince Rhaegar and the Mad King. The world had turned upside down, but the Tullus were still strong, and Ned's marriage to Catelyn Tully was now a bond of alliance. She was waiting for him, or so he hoped, having only briefly met and wed her before the war had truly begun. If there was any place south of the Neck where Ned could rest, treat Lyanna's fever, and find some measure of safety, it was Riverrun. They arrived on a dark evening, thunder rolling in the distance. The keep was lit from within by lanterns and torches. Banners of the leaping trout flapped in the wind as a passing storm spat rain across the parapets. Guards recognized the stark banner Ned carried and hurried to admit them. Maester Vyman was summoned immediately to tend to Lyanna, and the boy, though spurned as an afterthought by all but Ned, was given a cradle near his mother's bed. In the rush of activity, servants fetching bandages, fresh linens, and hot water, Catelyn Tully appeared. Her auburn hair was braided, her expression concerned. She had been told of Ned's dire mission, the search for his sister, and had waited anxiously for him. Now, seeing Lyanna so near death shook her. She reached for Ned's hand and squeezed it, letting him know she understood. Yet, beyond the immediate worry for Lyanna's life, there was the unspoken question. Who was this child Ned had brought? Catelyn cast a curious glance more than once, her eyes returning to the boy when she thought Ned wasn't watching. She said nothing, for which Ned was grateful, but he knew questions would come in time. If Lyanna died, Ned planned to name the babe as his own bastard, and that would wound Catelyn's pride. But there was no alternative, for Ned's promise to Lyanna was unbreakable. He could not let Robert or any other discover the truth. The next few days were a blur of tension and dread. Lyanna hovered at the brink of death, drifting through fevers and chills while Maester Vyman did his best. He applied poultices of herbs, forced potions down her throat, and changed her bandages constantly. The childbirth, combined with days of neglect and the shock of her injuries, had sapped her strength. More than once, Ned prepared himself for the news that she had passed. But some flicker of life, perhaps the same resolute spirit that had once led her to ride a horse as fiercely as any man, refused to surrender. Lyanna lingered. Finally, at the end of a fortnight, her fever broke. She lay pale, but coherent, looking up at Ned with eyes that shone with tears and relief. And in that moment, the fate of Westeros shifted on an axis no one had foreseen. "He's alive?" she murmured, voice soft as a whisper of wind through the weirwoods. Ned gently lifted the infant from a small cradle. The babe had grown enough that the shape of his face and the color of his eyes were clearer now. He had the dark gray eyes of House Stark, though there was a softness to them that might have come from his Targaryen side. Lyanna looked at him as though he were the only thing in the world. She touched a trembling hand to the child's cheek, tears gathering in her eyes. "My sweet boy." Ned swallowed hard, memories of the promise he had made cutting through him like a blade. "Lyanna," he said softly, "he is safe. But if Robert discovers that he is Rhaegar's..." Lyanna's hand closed into a fist, pressing against the linen sheet. "Robert, the war..." She shook her head, as though trying to reorder her scattered thoughts. She did not appear angry at Ned's suggestion of secrecy, but she looked anguished. "I must tell him," she said, but even as she said it, there was doubt in her gaze. "You know what that would mean," Ned said quietly. "Robert hates the Targaryen name. He hates all of them for what they did." "What they did to him," Lyanna said, finishing the sentence, though her voice trembled. "And for kidnapping me, though?" She closed her eyes, tears slipping free. Ned understood the unspoken truth, that she had once admired Rhaegar, or at least believed him to be different than his father, only to discover that she had been caught in a deadly game of politics and passion. "If Robert learns the truth, the child would be in danger," she whispered. Ned nodded grimly. "There is only one way I can see. If you wish him to live, we must hide his parentage. Let the world believe the boy is mine, a child I fathered during the war." He saw Lyanna flinch at that, but she said nothing. "You can claim I found you too late, that you were unwell and the child did not survive, or claim anything else you wish. But if Robert thinks your child is truly mine, not Rhaegar's, the babe will remain safe." Lyanna looked away, trembling. The child in her arms whimpered, and she soothed him gently with small, comforting noises. "It feels like a betrayal," she confessed in a hoarse whisper, "to hide his heritage, but I won't let him die. I won't let him suffer. Not for the sins of his father." Ned nodded, relief mingling with sorrow. He reached out and covered Lyanna's free hand with his own. "I'll keep him safe," he promised again. "Jon Snow he shall be called. I'll claim him as my own." Lyanna let out a slow breath. "Jon," she said, testing the name on her tongue. "Yes, that's a good name." And so the decision was made. Riverrun's halls would soon echo with gossip, but Ned knew he could quell it. He was, after all, the new Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, a man returning from war. Soldiers did father bastards in times of conflict. It was common enough. Catelyn would be humiliated, no doubt, but Ned hoped she would come to accept his vow, painful as it was. Yet, one question remained unspoken, looming in the air. What of Lyanna's future? If she survived, if she regained her strength, she could not stay in hiding forever. Perhaps it would be best for her to remain at Winterfell, living quietly. But that was no life for the sister he had known, fierce and proud. And more than that, what if Robert learned she was alive? That, Ned suspected, would ignite a storm as surely as any rumor. The realm believed her dead or as good as dead. If news spread that Lyanna Stark had been found alive, the entire realm would watch to see her reunion with Robert, the man who had gone to war for her sake. Or, at least, that was what the songs claimed. The next week, as Lyanna began to regain her strength, she and Ned spoke often in hushed tones. They spoke of Robert's victory, of Aerys' death, of the end of House Targaryen, of the child who slept in a cradle nearby. Tension flickered in her eyes whenever Rhaegar's name was mentioned, but she did not weep. She was beyond tears. her heart bruised and heavy with regrets she could not voice. She asked Ned about how the war had ended, about their family, about Brandon and their father. He told her as gently as he could, and she bowed her head in sorrow, eyes flickering with rage toward the Mad King for the cruelties he had inflicted. She had lost so much in such a short time, and yet she clung to life for the sake of the babe she now called John. Then came the day a raven arrived with the news that Robert was on his way to Riverrun, intending to meet with Ned and House Tully. The war had all but ended. The crown awaited Robert's claiming, with only formalities and final alliances to be sealed. Robert was eager to see his friend Ned, and, if the rumors were true, still mourning the lost love of Lyanna Stark. But if he arrived to discover Lyanna alive, and that she had borne a child, the risks loomed large in Ned's mind. Yet Lyanna sat up in her bed, her expression set in the determined lines of a Stark. "I will see him," she said. "I must." Ned did not try to stop her. Perhaps it would be better, he thought, to let Robert see the truth himself. If he truly loved Lyanna, he might accept her child, no matter whose blood ran in the boy's veins. Or so Ned dared to hope. Caitlin was another concern. She had heard the rumors. Ned had returned from the south with his sister, gravely wounded, along with a newborn babe he claimed as his own bastard. She had not confronted him openly, but the wounded look in her eyes when they passed each other in the corridor told Ned all he needed to know. He wanted to comfort her, to say something that would lessen her pain, but he had no words that could mend the situation. His duty lay first with Lyanna and the babe. At last, the day arrived. Robert Baratheon rode up to the gates of Riverrun at the head of an impressive retinue of loyal lords and soldiers. He had lost weight since Ned last saw him. His cheeks appeared hollow, and his eyes were overshadowed by grief. Yet there was also a triumphant air about him as the crowds cheered. He was the hero of the rebellion, the soon-to-be king. Banners with the crowned stag of Baratheon flapped in the breeze, bright gold on a field of black, proclaiming his victory. When he dismounted, Ned was waiting in the courtyard with Caitlin at his side, and Lyanna standing behind them, wrapped in a cloak. Howland Reed hovered nearby, watching with cautious eyes. The hush that fell over the crowd when they noticed Lyanna was palpable. Whispers rushed through the onlookers like a gust of wind. Lyanna Stark, alive? Robert stood rooted to the spot, eyes riveted on the woman he had believed lost. Tears welled in his eyes, and he let out a raw, gasping breath. "Gods!" he murmured. Lyanna stepped forward, the cloak rustling around her. She was still pale, still not fully recovered, but she held her shoulders back, chin high. "Robert," she said, voice trembling. Then Robert was moving, crossing the distance to her, and gathering her into a fierce embrace. She stiffened at first, perhaps at the memory of violence and captivity, but then she let out a sob and pressed her face to his shoulder. Cheers went up among the assembled men, for it was like something out of a legend. The lost maiden, found by the hero of the realm, and reunited in victory. Ned watched them silently, uncertain of what might happen when Robert learned of the child in Lyanna's care. But in that moment, none of that mattered to Robert. He had found his beloved, and she was alive. They moved inside soon after into Riverrun's great hall, where a feast was hastily prepared. Ned noticed that Lyanna kept her distance, not seeming to want to be alone with Robert just yet. Eventually, though, the time came for them to speak privately, and they retreated to a small solar off the main hall. Ned hovered outside, but did not intrude. Whatever was said in those hushed, urgent voices, he could only guess. He heard the occasional raised tone, Robert's at times, Lyanna's at others. He caught scraps of phrases, Rhaegar, kidnapped war child, then silence. Finally, Lyanna emerged. Her face was set, her eyes red-rimmed. Robert lingered behind her, looking thunderstruck. Lyanna did not look at anyone as she passed, nor did she speak. Ned went to Robert, who stood in the solar's dim light, hands balled into fists, chest rising and falling with quick breaths. "He took her," Robert said, as if reciting a fact he had memorized. Then he laughed, a short, harsh sound. "He took her, and he forced her to bear his child. By the gods, if he weren't already dead, I'd... His voice shook, and Ned sensed the swirling storm of rage and heartbreak behind his eyes. You cannot blame her for it, Ned said softly, mindful of how precarious this moment was. She was a victim of Riggers as much as you or me, or all the men who died in the war. Robert laughed again, bitter. But she bore the child. And now I am to wed her anyway? Is that what she wants? He shook his head. I asked her, Ned, begged her to be mine. She said she wants to do her duty. Ned swallowed, feeling the weight of 1,000 possibilities pressing on him. Lyanna was promised to you long ago. You fought this war in her name. The realm expects it. Robert's eyes flashed. The realm expects me to take a Targaryen's bastard into my bedchamber? Because that's what it amounts to, doesn't it? Ned kept his tone level. She is a Stark of Winterfell. Her child is, well, she says it is mine that I fathered him in the war. That is the truth we will present to the world. You need not acknowledge him as anything else. Robert's jaw clenched. Ned could almost feel the fury radiating off him. She wants me to pretend the babe is yours, that you had an affair while traveling, and she's decided to raise him as her nephew? Or as what, exactly?